Afternoon, everybody. Just a few seconds there. We go 12:10 Arizona time. Great to have you on board today. Just a few. Seemed like the paper didn't have a lot that I thought I could share with you today that I thought would be of interest to my audience. I have quite the process I go through to select articles, and someday I may describe that process to you. I worked with a few buddies of mine and got a little bit better than it was before, but still working on it. By the way, complexity is one of the things I look at. Many articles are very interested, and you might find news items. You say, I wonder why Lee didn't cover it. Well, the complexity for a short call is just too much to get across. Also, a lot of numbers. If you have too many numbers and you're trying to convey that verbally, I'm still working on a deal where I can display a screen while I'm working. I'm still testing that and figuring out how to do that properly, and that may help me out a bit, but still working on that. So hang in there for some better improvements. But today I've got, I think, 4 good articles. First of all, Walmart is joining Microsoft in the TikTok bid. This was a real surprise to a lot of people. The company that owns TikTok, a Chinese company called ByteDance, is asking, has been known to ask around $30 billion for the company. Twitter, it's been reported as offered around $10 billion, but it appears like they're getting out of the running right now. And looks like Oracle's still in there with Microsoft, and looks like Google's backed out too. So, by the way, so the question would be, what are they buying? So those of you that have ever looked at TikTok, it's a bunch of humorous little quick videos of people doing dances or lip syncing to songs or doing stupid stuff. I guess that would be that description an old guy would give. Others might have a better description, that it's exciting and fun. And I understand where they're coming from. But what are they buying? I mean, so I suspect they're buying 2 billion users. By the way, that's the number of times that the app has been downloaded. I'm sure I'm counted in that, though the app is no longer on my phone. I looked at it and got rid of it just about the time that some of the security breaches were noted about it. So what are they buying? So, I was part of a company one time that we bought some companies, and in the end, I believe we bought the companies for the personnel. They were top engineers. The products they had were okay, didn't meld real well with our products. And maybe you can look at that with Walmart and looking at it with, what do they need 2 billion young people? Maybe many in the world are not even close to a Walmart store. So maybe they're buying users, and that's the way you buy them, and they're hooked on that app, and so you buy them and you're able to move them to other products that you might have. It's still confusing to me, and there's not been a lot of people in the marketplace talked about it. I'd appreciate your comments on that and see what you think they're really buying for that amount of money. Though lots of companies have a big cash position right now and no place to put it. It seems crazy, but it's a world that I don't understand. Nikki Haley. So Nikki Haley spoke during the Republican National Convention, and she's drawn some criticism. It's interesting, the dichotomy between the two conventions. If you are African American or an immigrant in the Republican, speaking in the Republican convention, you're open to much debate and criticism, specifically around your immigrant or African American status, and that's a rule that says they were off. You couldn't do that on the Democratic side, but and I understand it. Many liberals believe they own those groups, and they're not allowed to defect and go off, as many people would say, the reservation. And I would say, you know what I mean when I say that. So Nikki Haley's got immigrant parents. Her parents were Sikhs from India. You might remember Sikh men wear a turban, and of course the women wear a sari. So she's taken her middle name. Her full name is Nimrata Nikki Randhawa. So of course she married an American, has taken that American's name Haley and used her middle name. So of course the criticism right away, they didn't want to criticize her speech, so they criticized her. Well, she's hiding her Indian heritage, and she's trying to become American and hide all of her heritage and do away with it, which is nonsense. So look, I've traveled around the world for my job for many years, and I've been to many countries, and I've seen how names can change, and how in many countries people have two sets of names. They have a name that they use with Americans and Brits, and they have a name that they use in their country. Chinese young girls are part of the junior high school progression is they take an English name to add to their current name. And boy, the time they spend on it is amazing. I've always thought Americans pick names quickly, sometimes in the hospital room right after the baby is born and within 15 or 20 minutes. My experience, the Chinese, even in naming their own children, take a long time to decide the right name to make sure it works with it. But the Chinese take an English name. India, I mean, if you ever received a support call from India, do you ever remember taking a call and they say, "Hello, I'm Nimrata from India. How can I help you?" No, they say, "Hi, I'm Nikki, or I'm Sally, or I'm Bob." And a few times I've challenged it. I says, "Look, we know your name's Bob, not Bob. It's got your name has probably got 9 or 10 vowels in it, and it's a lot longer than Bob. But I understand why they do it. Okay, it's a lot easier for us to remember Bob and say Bob. So, for instance, in Korea, lots of the Koreans will take their first couple of names, use the initial from it, and have Americans call them by that name. And I've got a good friend in Korea that goes by HK. I kind of remember his real Korean name, but I've generally lost it because he knows the difficulty of Korean names and works to fit in the American and British environment, English environment. So this is not something that's unusual, and I certainly am not going to fault Nikki for this. I think her biggest sin was to become a Republican. And 2/3 of Indians, by the way, are Democratic, define themselves as Democratic voters. They're actually only beaten by African Americans in the amount of people in their ethnicity that vote Democratic. Only African Americans are 80, 85, sometimes approaching 88, 89% in Democratic vote. So interesting thing about Nikki, she's becoming very powerful. Her name is used a lot in the next 4 years as a presidential candidate, and I'm sure there's a lot of liberal people who would like to take this opportunity to knock her down a few steps. Interesting, on the opinion page today, the Wall Street Journal took a long editorial to explain the Trump summary for the first 4 years. And if you've read the Wall Street Journal for any time, you'll know that they've taken Trump on numerous times, and Trump hasn't liked it. He's called him out numerous times. It certainly is a more conservative paper, especially no doubt on the editorial page, it's conservative. But calling it conservative and calling a Trump fan is another thing. Wall Street Journal has certainly taken lots of shots at Trump, and I think many of them deserved. And that's why I like the paper, and that's why I share it with you. So their summary was his record is better than he and his opponents have made it sound. And and if you get the ironic part there, you say, well, how is his record better than Trump could have made it sound? Well, Trump does a lot of things that take away from his record, and I think that's the Wall Street Journal's point there. And he's also done a lot better things than his opponents would like you to believe. But their point at the top was there was a lot of fear by this crazy guy coming in, and our whole democracy, is at risk. Well, we're 3.5 years into it, and our democracy survived. The Constitution checks that we had in place 3.5 years ago are still there, and the balance of those checks are still intact. We can rest easy at night. I see the memes, I see the Facebook entries, and I marvel at them that how if we allow this guy to go 4 more years, our entire democracy and our Constitution is at risk. It survived the first 4 years. Amidst many, many attacks, it'll survive another 4 years, and the Wall Street Journal concludes that. So they went through a checklist of the items that they wanted to discuss and kind of give them not a report card on, but kind of yay or nay. So they said 2 of his biggest successes are the tax reform and the deregulation. And they said certainly that's led to historic low unemployment and huge increases in the economy in the first 3 years before the COVID hit. It certainly worked. Third item is tariff onslaught. It hurt manufacturing jobs. What it also hurt that I don't think Trump accounted for is the uncertainty, economic uncertainty. He added economic uncertainty when in fact the tax reform and deregulation had helped it. But again, you look at it and say, well, he didn't take us to full-scale trade war, and some victories in China with cyber criminals and IP theft has happened, and a little bit of victory in some more products that the farmers are going to see sold to China. So some minors there, some positives as we go through there. Fourth item, he reined in the administrative state. So, the college sex cases where they went back on these colleges says, look, you've gone way too far. You can't try these guys without hearing their sides. Has saved a lot of young people from a lifetime of a case that was presented against them without them being able to defend themselves. And the big one is the Waters of the U.S. Act. That was a crazy thing where, if farmers had, a mud puddle, and I think there's very little exaggeration on this, anywhere on their property, the bureaucracy could, tie them up, and them and their lawyers for years before any development of that occurred. So that was overreach by the admin state, and Trump has brought that back. 200 conservative judges. That's a big deal. He really bragged and said before, and in fact, showed who he would point to the Supreme Court. And I think that was a big deal. That will contribute to the limitation of government powers and religious liberty going forward. And I think a lot of people will look at that as being a huge success. The Senate certainly gave him a lot of support there, and worked through those diligently, and still are. He failed at repealing Obamacare. Looks like he's moved on to drug pricing now. Whatever that's going to do on drug pricing, I think the fear is that it may take some of the innovation out that the U.S. has led. Virtually every major drug find is found by Americans. Almost, 100% of them. And a lot of that's driven by the pricing that they can charge. But I think Americans have grown tired of that and said, look, why are we paying the full boat here? and foreigners are getting, including North in Canada, they're as well off as Americans are, and they're getting a great price when Americans are developing their drugs that are saving Canadians, and they get a cheap price. This doesn't make sense. We go across the border to buy them. I go across and can buy them cheaper in Canada, in Mexico, literally a 3-hour drive from here. Doesn't seem to make sense. Much cheaper, by the way. So no landmark immigration reform, but certainly increased border security, no doubt on that. Foreign policy, that was the biggest fear of Trump, right? That he would get us into multiple battles. He didn't understand foreign policy, and look out. That what would happen with a big ego, egomaniac, when he would wade into those rooms. Well, he did nix the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal, and it would seem that most Americans have moved on from that and found out that it really hasn't changed much. Americans still are improving their climate year after year. It hasn't stopped any climate improvement in the U.S., but it hasn't penalized us and let China get away with not making any improvement for another 20 years while they develop their economy. Moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. Remember the panic about that. The wars were going to erupt all over the Middle East. Didn't happen. Many countries have quietly moved to Jerusalem and followed the U.S. lead. So I think and by the way, it led to the Arab-Israel peace deal. That was unheard of, that we could get there a few years ago. So his courting of dictators, little to show for. China, Korea, you can go down the line, and little to show for, lots of fanfare. It may get somewhere in his second term if he makes it, but so far, little to show for. So then they jumped to his character, and their summary was, we got what we expected. We knew what we'd get with Trump, and I think the voters knew what they'd get. I hear a lot of liberal voters say, how could you possibly vote for this? People that voted for Trump knew what they were going to get. He's polarizing. He had a lot of petty feuds with a lot of people. He trashed loyal aides as they were walking out the door. He mashes up the truth. The interesting thing about mashing up the truth, and I think this is an interesting observation, he says it hurts him in a crisis. And so when he got in a crisis, and he was getting there every day and on the platform and talking about the COVID crisis, now you tried to figure out whether you could believe him or not. I believed at the time he should have used a dashboard with real data behind him, but he chose not to. I think lots of executives would have told him to do that, but he had lost a lot of credibility with a lot of his other mashing the truth, I call it, and the Wall Street Journal calls it similar to that too. He brawled with governors. He brawled with the press. Some of that deserved. Some of it could have been done quietly over a phone call without the press involved, but he did what he did. The question you've got to ask yourself is, if you look back over his first term, what would it have been like? What his term would have been like without the Russia conclusion and the FBI excesses? The FBI went after this guy with no proof, and in fact lied about it multiple times to actually spy on the campaign. You can argue about that all you want. The facts are there, and you can choose facts you'd like to look at, but numerous groups, including the Mueller investigations, looked at that, and I think the Durham, we'll see. I don't know if it'll happen before the election. I could care less, but it'll come out sooner or later, unless that gets squashed in a Democratic election. If they win the election, maybe they get rid of all that and move on. So, but you got to ask yourself, did we waste some effort that we could have gotten more done in this country, not due to the acrimony between the two parties that have grown since this last time with all of the battles going on? Wall Street Journal predicted that we wouldn't get a Mussolini. That's what some people say. We're going to get a dictator. You still hear that. He's a dictator. In fact, he won't leave. If he's not reelected, he won't leave. You'll hear that. I have no idea about what Trump that they've seen that he won't leave, but they'll say that. So we didn't get the Mussolini from Manhattan, is what he was called. But we did get a press that was very hostile towards the president, and a president that was inexperienced with the bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. He's handled that very badly. You had to know, as the chief executive of his own company, he had his own way, and the minions underneath him would, bow and go do his bidding. Well, Washington, D.C. doesn't work that. The minions underneath will try to get him out of office, which is what they try to do, right? So it's a different environment, and he's very experienced with that, and it showed. So going forward, the election question you got to ask going forward is his disruption worse than a Biden-Harris agenda? And so that's the question. I'm not going to try to answer that. That's the kind of question that you've got to answer going forward. You know what you're going to get with a Trump. I don't think there's any surprise in the next 4 years what you're going to get. You've already seen it. With Biden, you can look at the record, but you got to be careful because of the Democratic agenda, and you got to look at the platform and say, will there be people driving Biden to do something that's outside of his normal history? Last news, the Fed has made some changes that are huge to people around the financing business. First of all, they're banning what's called the Phillips curve that should have been abandoned 10, 15 years ago. But this is the curve where it says when unemployment drops, you need to raise the interest rates to head off the inflation that we know is coming. They knew that the inflation was coming. Well, maybe the economy's changed enough that Phillips curve doesn't matter anymore. In fact, they acknowledged that in their recent changes. Now they'll wait for inflation to happen, because with our economy recently, we were raising rates when they weren't necessary. Inflation wasn't happening; it didn't happen. So they've also changed. They used to want to have a inflation cap of 2%. Now they're saying they want an average inflation of 2%. Some say that's going to put a lot of uncertainty in the market because the timeline is less certain now. Before, if you're in the financial industry, you say, wait a minute, it won't go over 2% because, well, if it does go over 2%, we know what's going to happen. The Fed's going to get active in fighting it. Now it's questionable because they said, well, it's an average inflation of 2%. What does that mean? They're going to let it go to 3, going to let it go to 4? And what time period? 6 months, 9 months, a year? So a lot of questions about that. So quicker session today. Hope you enjoyed it. And thanks again for tuning in. Have a great weekend. And I'll see you tomorrow with a few updates from Saturday. We'll miss Sunday because no paper. And back at you Monday. Thanks again. Cheers. Have a great weekend.